This is Principles of Management, Chapter 9, Motivation. Motivation consists of the psychological forces that really make up a person's characteristics. Everybody is an individual and everybody has their own motivation and the roots of that motivation that would be unique to their circumstances and their innate personality traits. Direction is the type of behaviors that someone could engage in. Effort really relates to how hard an individual will work. And persistence is how hard someone will continue to try without giving up in the face of adversity. Persistence is sometimes referred to as grit in a business context. These three terms are important to understand when you're looking at figuring out how these models work and some of the theories that are associated with motivation. The nature of motivation can be broken down into three categories. You have intrinsic motivation, motivation that comes from within. If you are a self-starter, you're motivated to do something simply because you want to. You think it's important to do hard work. You don't need anybody from the outside telling you to do it. You drive yourself. Extrinsically motivated behavior comes from the outside. So someone is giving you encouragement. Someone is giving you an incentive in the form of a bonus or salary. That is what motivates your behavior. And pro-socially motivated behavior is potentially a combination of both the desire to benefit someone else from an intrinsic perspective or potentially from an extrinsic perspective. So pro-social is not to benefit yourself, it's to benefit others, but it can be linked to some degree to either intrinsic or extrinsic motivation. It's important to understand what is motivating someone. If an employee is intrinsically motivated, you may want to exercise different strategies in terms of trying to keep their motivation high, as opposed to another who gets their motivation extrinsically. You may want to provide them with some of the motivation to accomplish the goals that you're seeking. On this slide, they talk about the nature of motivation. Again, these are just basically terms. The outcome is what you get out of something. If you work hard and you get paid and you get a raise and you get a good position, you get job security, those types of things are the outcomes. It's essentially an accomplishment that you get. The input is what you do in order to get the outcome. So whatever contributions you make, showing up on time, doing your work, doing extra work, being dedicated, doing the type of behaviors that are necessary in order to achieve the outcome. The motivation equation is part of this graphic here. So we're looking at inputs from organizational members on the left, then the performances in the middle, and then the outcome. If you remember back in Chapter 8, when they talked about control, they had input, conversion, and output. It's a very similar model here. You get the inputs, you get the conversion or performance part where you're actually using the inputs, and then the outcome is what happens at the conclusion of the performance. So in the input side on the left, what you're doing is you're putting in your time, your effort, you're using your education, the experience and skills that you have, and the type of work behaviors that you have inherent in your capabilities. The performance is when you contribute to the organization according to the standards that they've created, and you apply all of the things from the inputs that you're bringing to the table. And then the outcomes are job security, benefits, pay. The outcomes for the company is that you're getting the job done. You also can feel the pleasure of doing interesting work. You can improve your life. There are a lot of tangible and intangible benefits that are associated with outcomes. Much of this is related to one of the biggest theories, which is the expectancy theory. And that is the idea that people perform and they are motivated because they have an expectation that they will achieve something at the end and that they will be able to get a reward for their performance. If you perform at a high level, and that high level leads to the outcomes that the company is looking for, then both the company and the employee would be satisfied because they get the desired outcomes that they're shooting for. So again, just breaking it down, expectancy is the perception that if I work hard, I will expect to get something at the end of the day. The instrumentality is the perception that an employee has about how much there is an association between my performance and the attainment of those outcomes. The performance is itself instrumental to getting the outcomes, therefore the term instrumentality. Valence is a subjective term that really applies to each individual employee. Different things may be important differently to other employees. So certain things may be more desirable to one employee than another. Maybe one employee puts a higher value on things like pay and promotion and status, whereas another may put some importance on the satisfaction that comes from a job well done and some other less tangible forms of outcomes. Expectancy, instrumentality, and valence. Here it is on a graphic. So you've got your effort, your performance, and the outcomes. The expectancy comes in between effort and performance because it's that expectation that drives the effort and leads into the performance. When you get between performance and the outcome, the instrumentality is really how much you believe that the high level of performance will get what you're trying to achieve, and then the outcomes are basically whatever people value. The next slide has an expectancy theory graphic again. When you have expectancy high, people think that if they try hard, they can perform at a high level, and there is motivation to do that because of the potential to get the outcomes that they're seeking. When instrumentality is high, people think that if you work at a high level of performance, that will get certain outcomes. And when valence is high, it's that you are desiring particular outcomes that might result from high performance. If you can get all three of them high, then the theory goes that you would have a high level of motivation. If you have employees who have high motivation, the idea is that their performance will reflect that level of motivation. They will end up being more productive. Need theories are based on the concept of need, which is essentially something that you need for survival and well-being. At its core, it would be housing, a roof over your head, food in your stomach. But other people have higher levels of need beyond the basics. So you want a challenging job, you want to be comfortable in your job, you want to be satisfied in your job, you don't want to be overworked, you don't want to be underworked. It's kind of like that Goldilocks theory. People want things to be just right. Under a need theory, the idea is that motivation comes from what you need. And again, this is relatively subjective. What people need is kind of personal to what they are valuing on their own. So you could have 20 different employees who have 20 different personalities, 20 different ways of being motivated, and they may have 20 different sets of needs that may not be reflective of a universal need throughout. Most of them will be there because they do want some of the same things, but there will be some variation among them. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you've ever taken another business class or any psychology class, this has probably come up. The hierarchy of needs is essentially a pyramid. The basic needs are at the bottom. The higher level needs are at the top. If you look at the bottom of this graph here, we'll start at the bottom of the pyramid. The lowest level needs are the things that you absolutely will need, and it's physiological needs. You need the basic things like food, water, and shelter, clothing. And the way that the company can ensure that this is provided for is that you're paying your employees enough to not have just a simple existence. They're able to actually meet all of their basic needs. The next level is safety. You want to make sure that you're in a safe, stable environment. Again, if you have job security, you don't have to worry about where your paycheck is coming from week to week. That can be satisfied on the job. The next step up from that is medium level needs, which is belongingness, need for social interaction, friendship. Some of that you can get from work. I don't know if you're going to get a lot of affection and love at work. It does happen. But mostly these are hierarchy of needs that apply both within and out of work. So of course we're looking at this mostly in the work context. If you have good interpersonal relations, if you have the opportunity for socialization, everybody who works for you is a human being. Everybody has the need to interact and be social. So if you have an environment where it favors that, then people will feel that these needs are being met. People also have esteem needs as you get closer to the top of the pyramid. You'd like to be able to feel good about yourself. If you get promotions and recognition of your accomplishments, that's helpful from work. And then at the top of the ladder or the pyramid is self-actualization needs. The idea is that you can become everything that you possibly could become. And this is at the top because you can't really focus on realizing your full potential if you're living out on the street. So you need to get the psychological or the physiological needs taken care of, safety, social needs, esteem needs. And then if they are taken care of, the theory goes that you can then focus on higher level needs. If at work you give your employees the ability to take the opportunity to enhance their skills, get training, put their talents to work, then that can help that self-actualization part of the pyramid. Hertzberg is another one who came up with a couple of theories. His motivation hygiene theory is also something that is pretty well known in the business world. Some of these, as we talked about before, some of the theories kind of cross over. They talk about some of the same ideas. Under Hertzberg, the theory draws a distinction between motivator needs, which is really related to the type of work that you're doing itself, and hygiene needs. Now, when we say hygiene, we don't mean like personal hygiene, like brushing your teeth and taking a bath and things like that. This is related to things that are associated with work that feed to your satisfaction and motivation. An employee's hygiene needs would be satisfied by doing things that they find pleasurable or enjoyable at work. These are aside from the main core of the work, the main objective of what's being done. That's why they use the term hygiene. It's kind of on the side. You need to pay attention to, but it's not the absolute core of what people are focusing on. So motivator needs under Hertzberg really relate to the nature of the work itself and how challenging it is. We talked about it before, and again, if we do that Goldilocks theory, the story of Goldilocks and the three bears, the girl walks in, one bowl of porridge is too hot, the other one is too cold, and then one is just right. So the Goldilocks theory of business is that you just get things that are just right, not too little or too much of anything. You want to have jobs that are not too easy and not too challenging, where they overcome someone's ability to be motivated, but it should be challenging to just the right degree so that people are able to move forward. Hygiene needs are related to the physical and psychological context. So if you're working in a dungeon, if you're working in a nice place, that's a better thing. If you have the ability to work from home when you need to, if your commute is okay, if the context that you're performing the work is pleasant, then that's going to make people more motivated. So motivator needs relate to the actual work. Hygiene needs relate to accessory elements of the work that you're doing. McClelland, again, is another business theorist. He came up with the needs for achievement, affiliation, and power. So employees feel a need for achievement. They want to succeed. They want to be able to do the tasks that they're assigned. When we talked before about things like task ambiguity, making sure people have difficult yet specific tasks that they need to perform, that's very important, and it kind of feeds into this. A lot of the chapters that we're looking at have elements that can build on each other. So if you have a desire to perform challenging tasks, you have to have a manager that's able to give you appropriately challenging tasks, give you the resources and able to support you, to give you the guidance and the direction to be able to succeed. The need for affiliation, this is very similar to that socialization portion of the Maslow hierarchy of needs. The amount that you want to be able to have good interpersonal relations with your managers, with your colleagues, with your peers, with the other people at work. And then the need for power is a little bit different. It's not one of the things on Maslow, but McClelland basically is stating that some people do have the need to have power. The amount of power which you can exert at work so that you can control or influence other people on the job. We talked about the type of power that you can have. You can have legitimate power, referent power, expert power. So the need for power is something that some people have a much higher need for it than others. You probably know people that would fall into that category, but everybody does, to some degree, have a desire to have some level of authority. Equity theory is looking at the idea of motivation by determining what seems to be fair. If I work really, really hard and the person next to me is not working particularly hard, and I make a certain amount of money every week and the person next to me makes more, I'm going to wonder if the situation is fair for me. Because if I'm working harder and I'm not getting as much on the output side as somebody who's working less hard and getting a bigger reward, I'm going to see that as inequitable. And if I think that it's inequitable, and again, this may be very subjective according to the particular employee that's involved, then that may have an impact on my motivation and my job satisfaction. And if I am demotivated because of things like understanding that my expectations are not being met or I'm being treated in an equitable manner, then I may not be motivated to work to my fullest extent. Equity in this context means justice, impartiality, and fairness. In other business contexts, equity means ownership. So if you're talking about having an equity stake in a company, particularly a corporation, your equity is the amount of stock that you possess. Equity in this context is more of the general term and relates to fairness. Inequity would be the lack of equity or the lack of fairness or being treated unfairly. The next slide shows the application of the equity theory. So if you look at the titles across the top, you've got condition, person, referent, which is the person that you're referring to or comparing yourself to. And then it gives a couple of examples. So if you're looking at equity in general, are you being treated fairly? You look at yourself or potentially another person, but you look at the outcomes and the inputs and whether or not they're balanced, and then you compare it to someone else. So you could be comparing yourself to another colleague, you could be comparing two other colleagues to determine whether or not there's an equitable condition. You could have underpayment inequity and overpayment inequity, which is when you compare your inputs and outputs and then figure out if it's the same or less than or greater than the inputs or outputs of the person that you're comparing yourself to. Underpayment inequity exists when you perceive that your input-output ratio is less than the ratio of the person you're comparing yourself to. Now, when we say perceives, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's automatic. So if the other person is making more than you, it could be justified by management because they believe that that person is more valuable, that their input-output assessment puts them at a justifiable rate of pay. You may disagree with that. So a lot of this can be subjective. It's not just a hard number. The person next to me makes 80,000, I only make 70,000. Well, maybe they make 80,000 because management has determined through the controlling function that they're better at their job than I am. I could subjectively disagree with that and still find this to be an inequitable situation, regardless of the justification that management might think. So managers need to be aware that it is a very subjective situation. It's not always based on hard data. It's really based on one person's perception. Overpayment inequity exists when you believe that you're actually getting a greater outcome. You're making more money than the other person next to you. Typically, people are going to be much more vocal about it if they believe they are being underpaid than overpaid, but there is a psychological consequence when you are making more money than someone else that you actually may believe is more valuable to the organization. While people may not complain about that as much, it may have an impact on their motivation because if they believe there's an inequitable situation in their personal comparison that they're making, that could parlay itself into a belief that maybe the organization isn't that fair and they could be treated unfairly themselves by having other people be paid more than them. The concept of equity and justice in organizations relies on a few concepts. One is procedural justice and the other is distributive justice. I probably should flip them here on this slide, but procedural justice is really the concept of due process. If you've ever gone to court or if you're familiar with the American legal system, the idea of due process is well known, or at least it's recognized. The idea is when you go to court, the process is in place where you file a complaint, you are given a hearing date, you are given the opportunity to defend yourself or to bring an action against another. You have the opportunity to be heard. It's not just that somebody's saying you did something wrong, you're going to jail, or you did something wrong, you have to pay somebody money. You have to go through the process where you have the opportunity to prove your case or to defend yourself. The process that you receive is the process that is owed to you. It is due to you. That's why it's called due process. Organizations don't have to be exactly like a court system, but there should be some process in place through HR and other managerial systems to ensure that whenever decisions are being made, whenever payment or discipline decisions are applied to employees, that you follow a process. When you follow a process and everyone follows the same process, it's much more likely that the participants will be treated fairly. Distributive justice is focused more on the outcomes of the procedural justice that's being employed. So you can go through the proper procedures and everybody has their day in court. But if you do something wrong and you get fined $10,000 in court and another person does the exact same thing wrong, even with due process, but they're only fined $1,000, the distributive justice is going to seem inequitable. So it's a combination of both having the opportunity to be heard, to follow a process that is due to you, and then the outcome, the distributive justice, the justice is meted out to everybody and distributed equally. The next slide talks about interpersonal justice. It's essentially the way that you are treated. You should be treated professionally with empathy. There should be no ad hominem attacks if you want to throw back to our critical thinking materials. Interpersonal justice simply means that you are treated the way that everybody else should be treated. You are not targeted by anyone for any reason. Informational justice, if you've ever worked for a place, it's very hard to understand whether or not you're working in an equitable situation if you don't know what the rules are. You could have the greatest due process and distributive justice system in your organization, but if your employees are unaware of it, they're not going to understand that they're being treated fairly and the same as everyone else. That's why many places have an employee handbook that explains, here's how you sign up for your benefits. Here's what happens if there's a problem. You can appeal this, you can get a raise here, you can, whatever the processes are. All of that is typically captured in some type of an organization's handbook that they can give to their employees. So informational justice is important because number one, it's important for the employees to know that the system exists and what will be expected of them once that process is put into place. But it also explains to the employees the rationale, why these processes exist and what is intended by their implementation. The next slide talks about goal setting theory. When we talked about planning earlier, we came up with a mission. You had to figure out what the organization was going to look like, what we're doing. Eventually, you get down into the lower levels where you get to the divisional goals and objectives, and then you get right down to the tasks. When managers set goals for their employees to follow, it gives them an incentive to achieve those goals. Typically, they tie it to some type of an incentive package. It may simply be tied to your performance evaluation and your salary, but there could be some incentives like giving bonuses for achieving particular goals, especially those that are a little bit of a stretch goal. When you have employees in an organization, they need to learn how to work there. They need to learn the requirements of the job. They need to learn how to perform the task according to the standard operating procedures. They also need to be involved and immersed in the organizational culture so that they can understand what would be appropriate within the given construct of the organization. So learning theories talk about how people may actually pick up new routines, learn new information, and be able to apply it to the job. The concept of learning is simply a change in a person's knowledge or behavior. When I was the director of training at an organization, there's an argument about training and education being different things, and training and development being different things. Learning is essentially a similar concept to training. What you do is you look at the current state, you look at where you want someone to be, and when you change their current state and give them the tools and information necessary to be able to perform different tasks, then they have learned something. And hopefully it would be a permanent change, because when you train someone and they don't go back to the job and start to implement it, they will probably forget it. If you have someone who has to learn a new computer system and then they go back on the job and they have to use that computer every day, it's very likely to be a permanent change because they are actively using the things that they've learned and it's being reinforced. In order to make sure that someone retains that knowledge that they've learned, you have to make sure that they're able to apply it. Operant conditioning is a theory that examines how people learn and in what situations would they learn most effectively. The idea is that people get rewarded for good performance and they are either not rewarded or even perhaps punished for bad performance. Positive reinforcement goes to the idea of giving someone a benefit when they perform what they're supposed to be doing. At the basic level, it's just getting a paycheck. Not getting fired, and getting paid and being able to work at a place is some minimal level of positive reinforcement. But when someone does a good job, the manager would want to do positive reinforcement. Just as we were talking about learning, if you can reinforce what was going on, people will understand that that's what they have to do. So when someone does a good job, it's important for a manager to point out that they did a good job. When they get that feedback, then they are more likely to apply the same things that led to that positive reinforcement in the first place, and it becomes retained behavior. Negative reinforcement is when you create conditions that encourage people to stop performing undesirable behavior. As is indicated by the name, negative reinforcement is usually managers behaving in a way with employees that the employees will not prefer. The way that you get them to perform at a level that you want is to let the negative reinforcement drop when the behavior is corrected. So you could be complaining to someone, you could be sitting them down and telling them this is a problem. You may restrict certain activities until their performance goes up to a higher level. It is the removal of that negative condition when the performance goes up that is the incentive for the performance to improve. Extinction is based on the elimination of conditions that leads to undesirable behavior. If people are hanging around in the lunchroom during work hours and they are not being productive, then you can close the lunchroom. You take away the condition that was leading to the undesirable behavior, and because that condition is no longer there to be exploited, then it leads to extinction. It just stops existing. Punishment is similar to negative reinforcement, although it is a more active result. So if somebody did something wrong, you could dock them a day's pay, as opposed to just telling them that they're under probation or something, and that probation gets lifted when the behavior changes in negative reinforcement. Punishment is reserved more for situations that are potentially dangerous. We had a situation where we have someone engaging in harassment or sexual harassment, or they're behaving in a completely inappropriate way. Sometimes you need to actually take action to protect the other workers, and that would result in more of a punishment than either extinction or negative situations. So it's really up to the manager to determine which one of these tools is the most effective. Typically, punishment can involve suspension or even firing. I did have a situation where one employee punched another employee in the face. That's not going to be a situation for negative reinforcement or extinction. it was punishment. And the punishment was he had to pack his things and leave because we fired him on the spot. So there are certain behaviors that require punishment. Not everything is going to be so extreme, but both negative reinforcement and punishment, and to a degree, extinction can create a bit of a negative atmosphere at work. And that can detract from the motivation of the employees to work well. So typically, if you can use positive reinforcement, that is preferred. And at least some studies have shown a correlation between places that have more positive reinforcement compared to either negative extinction or punishment in terms of output and performance and productivity. Each situation may be different and they may be justified, but you need to, as a manager, understand the purpose of each of these tools. Social learning theory examines how people learn and what motivates them, and it's really typically geared by learning from people around you, learning from your peers, learning from the culture of the organization, and studying the behaviors of others. People tend to be a little bit of a chameleon. They tend to mimic the behavior of those around them in a given situation, and social learning theory kind of takes a look at that. Vicarious learning is when you are motivated to perform certain types of behaviors because the other people around you are behaving in that way. If you see someone at work who is perceived as being successful, some of the routines, some of the habits that they do are things that you may want to implement in an effort to emulate what they do so that you can achieve the same level of success that they have. Vicarious simply means through another. So you learn by applying what someone else is doing. As the slide notes, it can also be called observational learning. You're watching the examples that are set by others in order to learn from it. From a manager, you have to know that vicarious learning takes place, and it can be both positive and negative. So if you have employees who have bad habits, who perform and behave in an inappropriate manner, other people may actually pick up on the negative side of it too. So when you have the opportunity to hire good, positive employees who set good examples, that kind of spreads. It's a little bit contagious. It can actually work its way down and have an impact on other employees. A self-reinforcer is typically the type of employee that is intrinsically motivated. The motivation is coming from within. They don't necessarily need to rely on the extrinsic goals and rewards. They basically decide what they want to do and they gain satisfaction from being able to achieve it. Self-efficacy is a belief about how well you're able to perform something. It's a little bit different than self-confidence. Self-confidence is just feeling that you're able to do something well, that you're satisfied with your station in life. Efficacy goes to effectiveness. So how well you're able to perform a particular behavior, it's your confidence level in that behavior in that particular context. So if I'm given an assignment and it's something that I know how to do well, I'm going to have a high level of self-efficacy. So I'm confident that I'll be able to perform a particular duty. Unsurprisingly, pay is related and associated with motivation. The slide here shows how pay impacts each of the theories that we've been talking about. So for expectancy, the idea is that you're going to work and you expect to be paid appropriately. So as far as the instrumentality, that's the connection between your performance and the outcome. The outcome would be the pay. If you're being perceived as having a low level of pay for the amount of work that you're doing, it's going to be demotivating. So if your expectancy is that you're going to be paid appropriately, at least according to your subjective values of looking at it, then the motivation could be high. The need theory, you have a lot of things that you need to take care of. You got to pay the rent, you got to buy food, you want to go on vacation. Pay translates into your ability to do all of those things. So pay can satisfy a lot of the needs that you're looking at. Equity theory, pay is again when you're looking at a referent, when you're looking at comparisons between the work that you're doing and the pay that others are getting for the same type of work, then that can also be a motivator. If you make more money than other people because you're performing at a higher level, the motivation is to perform at a higher level so that you can justify that pay and perhaps even get more. For the goal setting theory, pay is also linked to the attainment of goals. You can also tie bonuses and incentive plans to goal setting theory if you want to have a little bit of a stretch goal and make people do more than what they had been doing in the past. You can tie pay to the performance of those goals and give them a bonus for successfully completing the requirements of that goal. We talked about incentives a moment ago. A merit pay plan is when you have compensation that bases your pay specifically on performance. You could have a project that if you successfully complete it, you get a one-time bonus. You could be paid on a commission. There's a whole lot of ways that you can build in different types of pay, but merit pay is essentially incentives to have higher levels of performance. An incentive could be, rather than manipulating the amount of pay that people are getting, if you meet certain objectives and you perform at a high enough level, you could give someone the opportunity to purchase a stock option. The stock options are usually reserved for higher level management, top managers, senior managers, CEO, that type of level. A stock option is simply the opportunity to purchase a share of the organization, in this case a corporation. You'd be able to buy stock at a certain price at a certain period of time. A good example of this is when you have a new corporation, you may not have a lot of money to be able to attract people and pay them a high salary because your capital isn't that high. So what you could do is you could offer someone a salary and you could say, listen, if you stay here for 5 years, our stock is selling at $10 a share right now. It may be selling for $20 or $30 a share in 5 years. I'll give you the opportunity to buy 10,000 shares at $7.50, but you have to stay here for 5 years. That does two things. It makes sure that the person stays, and it also means that they will hopefully work a little bit harder to increase the value of the stock, because if they're able to buy it at a discounted rate, they can make a bigger profit when they actually exercise their purchase rights. If they perform well and the stock price goes up to $30 or $50 a share, after 5 years, they can buy those stock options and they can get it at a much lower price, which would be a huge benefit to them. So it would benefit both the individual and the company because their performance would have resulted in the stock prices increasing. Piece rate pay is typically exercised in manufacturing. It's when you're building some type of widget, you get paid on the number of widgets that you produce. So you get $1 a widget, you make $500, you make $500 that day. Piece rate is often combined with a base pay rate, so that if you have a bad day or you're incapable of going to work or a few things happen, you don't have a huge fluctuation in your pay. So you could get $300 a day plus 50 cents for every piece that you do. So that's a kind of a hybrid piece rate pay. Commission pay is based on a percentage of sales. So if you work at a car dealership and you sell a car for $50,000, you may get a 1% commission on that price, so you would end up getting $500. Again, similar to piece rate pay, it's very unusual to work on a straight commission because there's a huge amount of stress. If you don't sell anything as a salesperson, you don't make anything. So a lot of commission jobs also have a base salary, which would be a lower salary than you would ordinarily find, and you would have commission on top of it. So you would get $20,000 a year plus X percentage of sales that you make. So the idea here is that there is an incentive to make more pieces in a piece rate pay plan, or to sell more products in a commission pay plan, because the more you make or the more you sell, the more you get paid. I've mentioned it before, but it's important to ensure that quality is still part of this, because if you're paying someone on how many pieces of a product that they create, you have to make sure that the quality is still going to be there. So there must be some type of an inspection process. If I make 1,000 of these widgets a day, I can make $1,000, but if 50% of them are not very well made because I'm rushing my way through it to get as much money as I can, then that's going to be problematic. You have to make sure that you input the right type of incentive so that you reward the proper behavior. A scaling plan is essentially an incentive plan that is based on the ability of employees to cut costs. If I say we expect you to be able to complete this project with $50,000 worth of salary, if you can do it with less salary, $40,000, and we save $10,000, then the employees will get a cut of that savings. Again, it's basically a way that would hopefully benefit both parties. It would benefit the company because costs are reduced. It would benefit the employees because they can invent new ways and new processes of doing what they're trying to do to become more efficient and more productive, but they get a piece of the amount of money that they save. Profit sharing is different than stock options, where you're actually buying a piece of the company. Profit sharing is more for other employees. It can be for lower level employees. It doesn't have to be the high level managers that are getting the possibility of buying ownership in the company. What we could do is tell the entire company, if our profits go up by 5% next year, then 1% will be dispersed among all of you as a bonus for profit sharing. If our profits go up every year because our employees have an incentive to perform more effectively, more productively, more efficiently, then they will get a bigger check at the end of the year, because if the company's profits go up, so do the employees. So the incentive is there for them to work at a higher rate. The idea behind profit sharing is that if I have you on a salary and you work as hard as you possibly could and we make a bigger profit, what is your incentive to do that again? There isn't much, because you're on a fixed salary. If you work really hard and all of your colleagues work really hard and you make a bigger profit for the company, then you'll get your salary plus your profit share at the end of the year. And that ends Chapter 9.